Jacques Rime noted in 2009, quote, "It is very difficult to estimate Charles Journet's influence on the adoption of the Declaration, Dignitatis Humanae. But for him, Cardinal Journet played a certain role in the drafting of the Declaration, Dignitatis Humanae, mainly because he brought to an innovative text his guarantee as guarantor of the Church's immutable doctrine." End of quotation. Although Jacques Rime is undoubtedly a greater expert on the cardinal than I am, I think I can briefly try to show that the cardinal also intervened in a text inspired by his ideas and those of Jacques Maritain, updating the principles of a Christian regime, and in which he contributed, even at the doctrinal level, to highlighting certain important ideas already present in the text, especially those that preserved traditional Catholic doctrine. Hence my two parts. Number one, Abbé Journet's doctrine before the Second Vatican Council, and number two, Cardinal Journet's doctrine at the Second Vatican Council. Abbé Journet's pre-Vatican II doctrine. Marie-Agnès Cabane has carefully studied the theologian's pre-conciliar thinking. She notes that the cardinal used the expressions freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, and civil tolerance to designate religious freedom, both before and after Dignitatis Humanae. First focusing her research primarily on the period 1926 to 1945, and drawing on an article by the late Émile Poulat, she observes, quote, "The concept of religious freedom is a modern phenomenon, relatively recent, since it appears above all with Vatican II. It is therefore futile to attempt to trace its semantic evolution in Journet's pre-conciliar theological thought." End of quote. Without going back as far as Tertullian's Libertatem Religionis, we could point out that in the 19th century, religious liberty was already being used by French Catholics to designate their freedom to practice their own religion in the face of the encroachments of the state, due in France to the organic articles added by Napoleon I to the Concordat of 1801-1802. Just think of the General Agency for the Defense of Religious Liberty, created by Salinis, Lamennais, Lacordaire, Gerbet, Montalembert, and others. In the same vein, St. Pius X spoke of piena libertà religiosa to characterize the Constantinian Edict of Milan. Another example is Mexico, where the Liga Nacional para la Defensa de la Libertad Religiosa in 1925 fought against state persecution of the Catholic Church during the time of the Cristeros. On the other hand, in the 19th century, the term was also used, notably by the Christian Alliance, to mean something quite different, namely a senseless love of indifference in matters of religion, condemned in these terms by Gregory XVI in 1844. Whatever the case, Mrs. Cabane rightly notes, quote, "Cardinal Journet's recognition of the right to religious freedom at the time of Vatican II bears witness to a long process of reflection matured by confrontation with several major historical events that called into question the relationship between church and state." End of quote. According to this researcher, Journet first had to reflect on the theme of erroneous conscience involved in the crisis of Action Française, 1926-1927. This was followed by the problem of religious freedom during the Spanish War, 1936-1939. And on September the 5th, 1939, the Swiss theologian commented, quote, "The Holy War may have been undertaken in the Middle Ages in the name of a concrete form of Christianity, in the name of a sacred civilization. It could never be waged in the name of Christianity, in the name of the kingdom of God, in the name of the church as such. The time for sacred Christianity is long past. The time for secular Christianity had begun, and we wanted to work to make it possible. And now comes the time of total war, the time of savagery." End of quote. This brings us to the third major event, the War of 39-45, when Abbé Journet wrote in opposition to Nazi totalitarianism, leading to trouble with the Swiss censors and his own bishop. And Madame Cabane sees in this spiritual resistance a corollary of religious freedom. Monsieur l'Abbé, as he wanted to be called, right up to the end, shared from the outset the ideas of St. Thomas on natural law, as well as those of his great friend Jacques Maritain on the person and his innate rights, and consequently on the renewed way of looking at Christianity, different from that of the Middle Ages. Indeed, in 1945, he stated, quote, medieval concepts temporarily took on a sacred meaning. Heresy, for example, if heresy was persecuted, if violence was used to suppress it, it was not as heresy, but as medieval heresy, that is, as blowing up from within a city freely and constitutionally made up of Christians. When heresy becomes strong enough, it too will organize a type of sacred city, a sacred counter-city. It mobilized the prince for persecution and war against the old religion. This was the period of the wars of religion. They led to a dead end, no way out. Neither spiritual through conversion, because war does not convert, nor temporal through a peace treaty without ulterior motives, because religion does not disarm. This is the end, the bloody end of the sacred regime. Nothing can endure the church more or delight its opponents more than the desire to maintain a sacred policy in a world that has long since been transformed. A Christian policy refrains from forcing the conscience of non-Christian citizens, whom it groups with other Christian citizens, Catholics or dissidents, on the temporal level. It practices civil tolerance. It must neither fall into dogmatic tolerance, which regards all forms of belief or non-belief as equally acceptable, nor seek a doctrinal minimum common to all citizens, believers or non-believers. End of quotation. Even if at the time he still saw civil tolerance as an object of wisdom and not of right, it was no longer a question of applying the thesis when one was stronger and the hypothesis when one was weaker, but of the fact that sacred Christianity was based on Catholicism, even at the temporal level, which is no longer the case. The text just quoted explains sacred Christianity, but is not sufficient to justify it in terms of dignitatis humanae. What would do so is mentioned in passing. an absolutely crucial point to which it doesn't give the desired relief, and that is the absence of interconfessional reciprocity in matters of religious freedom, making it necessary to use the secular arm when another denomination develops that endangers the future freedom of Catholics. In any case, Marie-Agnès Cabane, moving on to the post-war period, observes, quote, "After the Second World War, Charles Journet was more interested in the various religions in their relationship with the Catholic Church than in the problem of the existence of religious freedom in the life of states." End quote. Nevertheless, we should note the existence of an article in Nova et Vetera on our specific subject, essentially integrated into his masterwork, L'Église du Verbe incarné, Essai de théologie spéculative, tome 1, La hiérarchie apostolique, the first edition of which dates from 1941, in the midst of the war, on the new form of Christianity that could be envisaged in a society comprising several religions, specified, quotation, "The political power we are talking about will therefore refrain from forcing the conscience of its subordinates and can only take note of the multiplicity of spiritual families to which they belong. It will practice civil tolerance. His entire role, his entire effort will be to unite these men as citizens and on a temporal level, according to the rules of a policy that will itself be Christian in its inspiration, its means, and its ends." End of quotation. In particular, Journet extends to Christians separated from Rome a civil tolerance that Aquinas reserved for non-Christians. And like Jacques Maritain, he takes care to distinguish such a position from that of the liberalism condemned in the 19th century. Quote, "The error of theological liberalism would be to claim that by virtue of a right of human opinions, whatever they may be, to be taught and propagated, the city would be bound to recognize as the juridical status of each spiritual family the law elaborated by it in accordance with its own principles. We mean something quite different here, namely that to avoid greater evils, which would be the ruin of the peace of the community and a hardening or softening of consciences, the city can and must tolerate within it. To tolerate is not to approve ways of worshipping which deviate more or less seriously from the true. Ritus infidelium sunt tolerandi, taught St. Thomas. Ways of worshipping and therefore also ways of conceiving the meaning of life and ways of behaving, and that a city consequently decides to grant the various spiritual families living within it legal structures which it itself, in its political wisdom, appropriates on the one hand to their state and on the other hand to the general orientation of legislation towards the virtuous life and to the prescriptions of the moral law, towards the fulfillment of which it directs as far as possible this diversity of spiritual families." End of quotation. Moreover, Journet, like Maritain, is aware that only a society guided by the teachings of the Church will provide such an orientation as perfectly as possible. What's more, his conception of secular Christianity, far from excluding the duties of the state towards God, professes them on the contrary, wherever their application remains possible. And Journet goes a long way in this direction. Quotation, "It goes without saying that under both secular and sacred regimes, The earthly city as such has duties towards God, that it must be deeply religious and Christian, that it must collaborate effectively with the Church. But to fulfill these duties, it will not be forced to enforce denominational conformity, nor to establish interdenominational cults. Its Christianity will manifest itself in the elevation of its temporal ends, the purity of the political means it employs, the public homage it pays to the Christian values on which the entire sanctity of the temporal order depends, and its constant respect for the rights of the Church. We could even conceive, in a secular regime, of a recourse of canonical power to the secular arm, no longer undoubtedly in the medieval form and with regard to all the members of the city, but with regard only to those who would come under the jurisdiction of the Church." End quote. Without in the least condemning the medieval regime, Journet explains it, but declares it inapplicable today, and moreover, not required by the nature of things. Quote, "Those who did not visibly belong to the Church were immediately cast out of the city. Gentiles on the frontiers, Jews in the ghettos, for those who, initially Christians, then broke with the Church, such as heretics and schismatics, they were, as we shall say, a far worse danger. They shook the foundations of the new city and appeared as enemies of public salvation. The medieval city thus presented itself as a composite whole, as an agglutination of the spiritual and the temporal that was not required by the nature of things. What the nature of things requires is the distinction between the spiritual and the temporal, and the subordination of the latter to the former, not their alliance as component parts of the city. And it is always possible to conceive another type of Christian city." End of quotation. We have noted that this characterization of sacred Christianity is not sufficient to justify this medieval policy without adding the observation of non-reciprocity in matters of religious freedom, a point acquired only after 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the first General Assembly of the Ecumenical Council. To understand the present remark, we need to reread Dignitatis Humanae, number 7, paragraph 3, on the peaceful harmonization of the rights of all, a criterion limiting religious freedom, limiting the exercise of a religious freedom. In 1953, Journet recalled the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas on the natural right of non-Christian parents not to be deprived of their children's education under the pretext of baptizing them and educating them as Christians. This would be against natural justice. This doctrine, confirmed by Pius XI, shows that while a person may not have the right to act in an erroneous manner, in this case to educate his children in a religious era, he may have the right not to be prevented from doing so. This distinction between an affirmative right to error, which does not exist but is assumed in condemned liberalism, and a negative right, the right not to be forced or prevented from acting, which is proper to Dignitatis Humanae, which Journet does not specifically highlight, will become essential to understanding Dignitatis Humanae. So let us come to Cardinal Journet's doctrine at the Second Vatican Council. Charles Journet, ordained bishop on February the 20th, 1965 by Bishop François Charrière, and made cardinal 2 days later, was ipso facto called upon to take part in the fourth and final period of the Council, when the Declaration on Religious Freedom was finalized. There had been several drafts. During the preparatory phase, a first private text drawn up by Bishop Émile Joseph de Smet and Louis Janssens was drafted in Fribourg on December the 27th, 1960. The debate on the fourth schema, Textus Remendatus, from September the 15th, 1965 to September the 21st, involved a total of 65 speakers, including the rapporteur, Bishop de Smet. 22 opposed the text, 27 proposed considerable modifications, 15, including Journet, were very much in favor. This discussion took place on the new draft presented alongside the old one, with an oral report and a written report explaining the modifications accepted or not. On the 19th of September, the Cardinal had wondered whether he should speak at all. It was Father Jérôme Amer, a Dominican, head of the subcommission drafting Dignitatis Humanae, who in a letter to Father Cotier obtained Journet's intervention on September the 21st. In it, the Cardinal notes a fundamental doctrinal unity among the Fathers, but pastoral dissensions. He proposes to highlight some themes in the outline. First, the human person belongs to two orders: temporal, social, political, and spiritual, gospel, church, etc. As for the temporal order, the person in one aspect is part of civil society, in another aspect transcends civil society, and being free with regard to society is accountable only to God. This doctrine is found in Dignitatis Humanae number 3. The third point expresses that will be the central doctrine of Dignitatis Humanae number 2 and also of Gaudium et Spes 16, quote, "The man who errs or sins or whose conscience is mistaken is nevertheless a human person and must be considered as such by the political society to which he belongs. He could only be constrained by this society if he were to commit external acts likely to destroy true public order. On the other hand, this man will one day have to give an account before God of the guilt or non-guilt of his own conscience." End quote. Other quotation, "Civil society too has a duty to publicly manifest the honor it reserves for God. Consequently, civil power itself cannot ignore the various religious families present in the city, and it is its duty to have recourse to them so that God may be worthily honored by all." End quote. This last assertion by the prelate had hitherto been advocated only in a case of clearly multi-religious nations. The state, even if Catholic, had to allow non-Christian cults civil freedom of worship, even public worship, but within fair limits implicitly mentioned in the textbooks, namely public morality, the rights of others, respect for the objectively good laws of the state, and public peace. In a country lacking sufficient Catholic unanimity, the state was to authorize all religious practices that met the above criteria and was not to interfere in purely religious disputes. Indeed, it no longer relied on the magisterium. The natural duty of religious worship of any kind on the part of society was to be found in the concluding report of September 21st and in Dignitatis 6, paragraph 2, but even more specifically in Dignitatis number 1, paragraph 3, will have dealt with the moral duty of societies towards the true religion and the Catholic Church. Quotation, now it's quotation of Dignitatis Humanae. "Now, since the religious liberty that man claims in the fulfillment of his duty to worship God concerns his immunity from constraint in civil society, it does not prejudice the traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of man and societies towards the true religion and the one Church of Christ, end quote. This also concerns the moral duties of public authorities towards true religion was confirmed at the beginning of the last written report dated November 17, 1965, on the express orders of Paul VI, and in the absence of the hospitalized Father John Courtney Murray, who was strongly opposed to such a specific duty for societies. Perhaps under his influence, this point has been overlooked by the vast majority of commentators. On the other hand, Jérôme Amer interprets it as follows: the declaration emphasizes that this duty affects not only individuals but collectivities, that is, men acting in common. I come to point number 5. In addition to the natural right of men, there is the supernatural right of the Church. Quotation from Cardinal Journet: the above concerns the rights of human persons, but Christians know that beyond this order, the Church, by the very will of God in Christ, possesses the supernatural and inviolable right to freely preach the gospel to every creature. The apostles and martyrs died as witnesses to this freedom, end quote. This supernatural right to libertas ecclesiae will be professed in Dignitatis Humanae, number 13. Point number 6. Journet goes so far as to approve the use of the secular arm in sacred Christianity. I'm afraid I don't have time, apparently, to read that paragraph number 6. So the Cardinal concluded, I jumped to his conclusion, for all these reasons, the present declaration seems to me to deserve full approval. On his written remarks sent to the Commission, Father Jean-Pierre Torel notes, he nevertheless makes numerous amendments to the text, which are not so much criticisms as constructive proposals for improvement. On September the 30th, 1965, Pope Paul VI received Bishop de Smet and handed him a note demanding that the text be improved in line with the obligation to seek the truth, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, and a presentation consistent with the traditional teaching of the ecclesiastical magisterium, without the state being able to claim to be absolutely secular and without releasing it from any obligation towards the Church. The drafting committee then submitted its future textus recognitus to Cardinals Brown, Urbani, and Journet. The latter reacted with a letter to Bishop Johannes Willebrands, dated October 13th, and another to Paul VI, dated October 14th, in which he expressed his satisfaction. He proposed just 4 animadversiones ad schema de libertate religiosa, including that it is not the erroneous conscience that is respectable, but the person whose conscience is erroneous. The Cardinal did not intervene publicly on this 5th outline discussed on 25th October, nor on the 6th and final one, Textus de Nuo Recognitus, presented to the Fathers on November 19th and definitively approved on December the 7th, 1965, by 2,308 votes in favor, 70 against, and 8 null votes. Conclusion. In conclusion, it should be noted that the Cardinal's oral intervention is in full continuity with his remarks prior to the Council, set out within the framework of his theology of the relationship between Church and State, itself marked by Jacques Maritain's thinking on the replacement of sacred Christianity by profane Christianity. On the other hand, it played a key role in winning the support of many still hesitant fathers for the declaration. Last but not least, it underlines certain doctrinal points already left intact by the Textus Remendatus, but made clearer in the final text. It should be noted, however, that only the animadversione scripto exhibite refer to the need to determine which body can set out the objective criteria for limiting the exercise of the right in question. Dignitatis Humanae does not, and nowhere does he list the duties of public authorities towards the Church. Neither will Dignitatis Humanae. These include the state's respect for the Church's social doctrine, and in particular for the fundamental rights of the person, the most precious part of the common good, as Pius XII said, as well as the conformity, not only verbal but real, of laws and modes of government to the objective moral order, discernible by natural reasoning, but taught de facto in its entirety by the Church alone. All this constitutes the traditional Catholic doctrine which Dignitatis Humanae No. 1, paragraph 3, says it maintains. This will be realized in our societies through the inspiration of laws and structures by the Christian spirit. Thus, we can neither claim that Dignitatis Humanae No. 1 has simply reaffirmed the thesis of the confessional Catholic state in the form known in the past, nor, conversely, that Dignitatis Humanae exclusively requires the creation of a favorable climate towards religion in general. Thank you for your attention.